Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event of the United Nations Environment Program. Welcome from all countries of Latin America and the Caribbean and beyond. Um, as you know, Latin America is gravely impacted by climate change. 9 out of the 20 countries with the largest impacts in climate change are in our region, according to the Global Commission on Adaptation. And about 1.5 degree increase in temperature. So this is according to what we expect if we comply with the goals of the Paris Agreement. That would cause about 100 to 200% increase in the population affected by high impact floods in countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, and up to 300% in Ecuador and 400% in Peru. The Ipcc recent report of the Working Group 2 has already told us of the grave impacts of climate change, not only that we are experiencing today in our region, but that we will be experiencing in the future. But there are solutions for that. Ecosystem-based adaptation measures are highly positive in terms of avoiding losses of climate change, but also creating positive economic benefits, creating jobs, as well as other social and environmental benefits. For instance, according to international studies, for every $1 million invested in nature-based solutions, close to 40 jobs are created, which is about 10 times the amount of jobs that can be created for the same amount of resources in fossil fuels. So, what's necessary to make nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation implemented in our region? Well, according to most studies out there, the principal problem is lack of resources. And approximately only 25% of resources dedicated on global climate finance are going to adaptation. So this is a topic that is extremely under-financed. We think that much more can be done here. And this is why it's very, very important to engage the private sector and especially small and medium enterprises in these activities of promoting ecosystem-based adaptation. UNEP, in collaboration with IUCN, has launched the Global Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Fund, GBAF, which is currently at its 4th round of submission, and it's supporting different organizations all over the world to implement ecosystem-based adaptation measures. Now, in the current call, which is going to start presently, the focus is small and medium enterprises. And this is what we're going to be presenting today by my colleagues Samali and Nora. How can small and medium enterprises be selected for implementing ecosystem-based adaptation measures under this fund? So I'm calling you to follow these discussions, and I'm calling you to participate in this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo, for bringing some insights about the challenges that the Latin America and the Caribbean region faces to adapt to climate change, but also mentioning some great opportunities for the region to keep promoting climate resilient development paths and involving more actors in the conversation and in the actions to be taken. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar titled Supporting Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises to Adapt to Climate Change. My name is Angela Prias, and it is a pleasure to be moderating this event. This webinar is organized by UNEP with the support of the Global Adaptation Network and Lightsmith Group, and it aims to highlight the need for engaging the private sector in climate change adaptation action, and also share some initiatives that currently support SMEs to take action on climate change adaptation. I want to remind the audience that this event is going to be transmitted in English, but we have live translation to Spanish as well. So we are sharing both links on YouTube, on the YouTube chat, So you can choose to follow the event in the language you prefer. We are also sharing a link on the YouTube chat box for the attendees who would like to be part of our database so we can share more content through the year. Now we are going to officially start the event. So this is a very special event because we are here to talk about how businesses can become more sophisticated in their understanding of adaptation opportunities and how from the international cooperation and the public sector we can support them in order to reduce the risks and as well for the implementation and investment in climate change adaptation. We would like to know a little about our audience today. So we have shared a link to a Mentimeter survey on the YouTube chat. You will find the questions both in English and Spanish. So please take a minute to answer the questions and we will check the statistics together. Did you find the link on the chat? Okay, so here we have our first question. I'm going to share my screen. So here, which country are you joining us from today? So we have Guatemala, we have also people from Colombia, many people from Colombia, Honduras, Kenya, Panama. I'm going to give some more minutes, some more seconds to answer the question. Oh, I think you cannot see my screen. Just 1 second. Can you see my screen now? Hopefully you can. So for this first question, we have people from Cuba, Argentina, El Salvador as well is here. Okay, so we have also from Guatemala, more people from Colombia. Cuba as well. Okay, we are going for the second question. What type of organization do you belong to? So we have governmental institutions, NGOs, UN agencies, more people from UN agencies. What else do we have? NGOs. We also have people from universities and some people from private companies. Great. But I think that the most representative groups we have today are governmental institutions and UN agencies. Okay, the statistics are changing again. We have more universities as well. Another one from the private company. We also have a community-based organization joining today. So we have a very diverse audience today. We're going for the third question. And this is, are you familiar with the term climate change adaptation? Okay, 86% of our audience said yes. Well, most of our audience say yes, and the rest say I'm not sure. Okay, I think that a big part of our audience already know the term climate change adaptation. We have 25 answers at the moment, and more than 90% of them are already familiar with the term climate change adaptation. Okay, and our last question would be, what expectations do you have about this event? So it could be a word or a small sentence. What you like to share with us about your expectations? Learn new experiences of conservation. Okay, great. That could be very related to climate change adaptation. What else do we have? Okay, bridge the gaps. It is going to be interesting. Clear information about the formulation of proposals and the way and learn how to apply to the initiatives that are available. Some people are interested in knowing the other initiatives of climate change adaptation and how they could apply from Chile. Some information about financing that is available. To know more ways to be able to contribute to climate change adaptation action. Awareness. To know opportunities that could contribute to climate change adaptation or resilience, and also how to intervene from the small and medium sized enterprises and contribute to climate change adaptation. Okay, those are great answers. Also, some people suggest no alternatives to develop agriculture in very low rain seasons. Learn ways to be better. Know the indicators of climate change adaptation that would be applicable to the private sector. Great. And review the possible contributions that the initiatives from the private sector could give to meet the NDS. Okay, great answers. Thank you very much for engaging in this exercise. Financing for SMEs for adaptation. How to make the financing mechanisms operational for the implementation of adaptation from the private sector. Great. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for your answers. Now, we are going to start the second session of this webinar. So now I'm going to project the agenda of Lee. If you can help me with that, please. Thank you very much. The agenda would be the first slide. We will have three fantastic speakers today. Sumali Kozla will give us an overview of adaptation finance and the need for private sector engagement. Then Brian Parham will present the ASAP Accelerator, followed by Nora, who will talk about the Global Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Fund. After that, we will have hopefully enough time for some questions and answers. And please leave your questions on the chat at any time, and we will communicate them to the speakers during the session. Finally, we will have a last 20-minute question and the recap of the main takeaways of the webinar. Okay, so let's get started with our first speaker. Sumali Kozla currently is the Global Climate Adaptation Finance Advisor at the UN Environment Programme's Climate Change Adaptation Unit, with over 17 years of expertise across climate change, sustainable development, and finance areas. Welcome, Sumali. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. If I can request Ophelia to please share my presentation with the audience. We can take a minute for that to come up. My presentation today will look at adaptation finance, as Angela mentioned, and the private sector for the Latin American and Caribbean region, which I'm going to call LAC during the course of my presentation. Next slide, please. I will first briefly go through the impacts of climate change and the case for financing adaptation, which includes the adaptation finance gap from the perspective of global climate flows and adaptation costs. Next, I will present on issues related to the bankability of adaptation interventions and challenges that this poses for private sector investments. And finally, I will look at the role of SMEs in financing climate change adaptation in the LAC region. Next slide, please. I want to start by highlighting some of the key outcomes of the Ipcc 6th assessment report and to complement what was mentioned earlier during the opening remarks. First, that climate change impacts are currently being recorded across continents, and some impacts of which are irreversible into the future. Second, that emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities are responsible for approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming since 1850 to 1900. Third, that over the next 20 years, global temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, specifically for the LAC region, the Ipcc report states that temperatures have increased more than the global average and is likely to continue to do so. So what this means is that it has also projected changing precipitation patterns, more sea level rise, coastal flooding, and heat waves. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is that the impacts of climate change are already devastating and to the region, particularly. To highlight this, what I'd like to mention here is that without adaptation, climate change may depress global growth in agricultural yields up to 30% by 2050. In fact, around 5 million small farms around the world will be most affected. In addition, the number of people who may lack sufficient water for at least 1 month per year will increase from 3.6 billion today to more than 5 billion by 2050. Climate change could push more than 100 million people in developing countries below the poverty line by 2030. Specifically for the LAC region, between 1998 and 2020, climate-related geophysical events resulted in the loss of over 300,000 lives and directly affected more than 277 million people. The report on the state of climate in Latin America and the Caribbean for 2020, which was released last year, provides a snapshot of the effects of increasing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, storms, and retreating glaciers for the region. And that would be a very interesting report to refer to for further information on these impacts. This also would include impacts of the Hurricane Eta and Iota in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, the severe drought and fire season in the Pantanal region of Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina, and the threat of fires and deforestation to forests in the region. In fact, the LAC region accounts for about 57% of the world's remaining primary forests, and the loss of these forests, which is currently happening, will adversely affect the equilibrium of ecosystems and related livelihoods. Next slide, please. Now, whilst the impacts of climate change and the need for adaptation is clear, the adaptation finance gap is still vast. The majority of globally tracked climate finance continues to flow towards activities for climate mitigation. According to the Climate Policy Initiative's report, The Global Landscape of Climate Finance 2020, global mitigation finance accounted for the majority of the total annual climate finance flows in 2019 and in 2020. Global adaptation finance made up only US dollars 46 billion, and most of that came from the public sector. About $15 billion was allocated cross-cutting themes. So that means what includes both mitigation and adaptation. And more projects and programs need to be moving in this direction. So looking at mitigation with co-benefits in adaptation, or adaptation with co-benefits in mitigation. Now, on the flip side, if we look at the costs of adaptation, according to UNEP's 2021 Adaptation Gap Report, the estimated adaptation costs in developing countries are 5 to 10 times greater than current public adaptation finance flows. In fact, the costs of adaptation are likely to increase to US dollars 280 to 500 billion per year by 2050 for developing countries. The main takeaway from all this information is that there is a clear mismatch between the costs of adapting to climate change versus existing finance flows. And to bridge this gap more rapidly, private sector finance, particularly from SMEs in the LAC region, will be needed and will need to be mobilized rapidly. Next slide, please. Briefly looking at this map from the Climate Policy Initiative report, we can see that the climate finance to the LAC region was about US dollars 35 billion of the global total of US dollars 632 billion per year. So what we can say is that it's just a fraction of the global amount, and that global amount includes developed countries as well. In fact, if we look at the yearly financing for adaptation to the LAC region, that was only US dollars 9 billion of that total. Next slide, please. With this slide, I want to mention that when looked at from the economic, social, and environment perspectives, the benefits of investing in climate adaptation often outweigh the costs. So adaptation actions bring multiple benefits. These are called the triple dividend: avoided losses, positive economic benefits, social and environmental benefits. Just to take one example from this slide, in terms of avoided losses, making infrastructure more climate resilient can add about 3% to the upfront costs, but has a benefit cost ratio of about 4:1. So the payoffs are much greater than the costs, the upfront costs. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the bankability of adaptation interventions and some of the challenges for private sector investments. Let's start with what is a bankable climate adaptation project or project. It is basically a project that meets the financiers or specific banks' requirements. Typically for the private sector, a bankable project is one that would provide a return on investment. The specific terms of the financing and expected returns depends on the financier and their expectations. For climate adaptation interventions, this poses several challenges. First, adaptation investments are mostly in public goods, for example, flood defenses, or in non-market sectors, for example, health, and thus they do not generate an income stream. Second, several adaptation interventions reduce the risk of future damages, which means that even if they generate a revenue stream, it is not an obvious and upfront return on investment that most investors require. So there's often this mismatch between the timing of an adaptation investment and its cost, which is in the short term, versus the time when the benefits are actually delivered, which is in the medium or the longer term. The next issue is that climate impacts and assessments for adaptation is a highly technical and often difficult analysis, and all of this can increase project design and implementation costs, which further reduces the investment attractiveness of the adaptation interventions. Yet another challenge is that in some cases, adaptation involves a large number of individual actors to work together, and thus the transaction costs are much higher than with a single large investment, which is what we usually see for mitigation. Also, in addition to these challenges, inadequate capital markets, which is the case for a lot of countries in the LAC region, act as a barrier to private sector adaptation finance. And what I mean by this is that these markets are not able to efficiently allocate capital or transfer risk for climate-related adaptation actions. For example, it is often reflected in the lack of financial instruments to meet capital market requirements, and this could be for project risk mitigation. As an example, insurance and guarantee products, etc. Now, other challenges that are indirectly related to private sector investments for adaptation are firstly, competition for available public finance resources. So to take another example, subsidization of non-adaptation health-related activities are often given the priority instead of climate-smart technologies for agriculture. Further barriers include weak government arrangements for adaptation finance, low access to affordable climate-smart technologies, and also generally a lack of cohesive policy and regulatory frameworks for adaptation. Now, due to these various issues and challenges that I have mentioned for private sector investments, adaptation has mostly been financed by the public sector and mostly through grant funds. And this needs to shift towards engaging with the private sector, creating opportunities for the private sector to invest in adaptation. Next slide, please. This slide highlights that small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, are a primary source of employment and key supply of goods and services to a very large share of the population in the LAC region. To emphasize this, as per the UNDP or UNDP report, SMEs comprise as much as 99.5% of all businesses in the region, making up a very large portion of the private sector. And in fact, if we look at this number, almost 9 out of 10 SMEs are classified as micro enterprises. SMEs in the LAC region also account for 60% of the employed population, but only 25% of the GDP of the region. And this is reflected in the unmet financing that SMEs require. And this is, it's one of the really big challenges for SMEs. In fact, the IFC, so the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, estimates that the financing gap for SMEs in developing countries is about US dollars 5.2 trillion per year, with the LAC region requiring the second largest share at 23% of this total after East Asia and the Pacific. Now, due to the lack of financial and technical capacities, the small size of SMEs, the impacts of climate change on them are very high, including risks to cash flows. These are caused by assets damaged due to climate-driven extreme weather events, increased operating costs, unpredictable shifts in demand, and also just general disruption of supply chains. So in a nutshell, there is a need to put in place the enabling policy and fiscal environments to encourage entrepreneurship across SMEs to drive innovative climate adaptation solutions, or maybe very simply to scale up existing adaptation solutions that are successful in the region and replicate them across the region. This in turn also leads to innovation and promotion of blended finance structures, which will further mobilize private sector finance towards and from SMEs. Next slide, please. Just to conclude, I'd like to reiterate that engaging and supporting SMEs in climate adaptation is critical to mitigating the impacts of climate change in the LAC region. And these measures could include unlocking a private sector climate finance, but at scale, and creating the opportunities at scale, aggregation of the opportunities across SMEs, diversifying the climate risk profile of the adaptation project portfolio in general per country, per sector for the region, the promotion of social inclusion and gender equality, and generally assuring the long-term prospects for sustainable development in the region are very much tied in to the adaptation interventions that are being implemented. I will end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention. And back to you, Angela.
Thanks, Mali, for that great introduction, and thanks for highlighting those different factors that pose challenges to increase adaptation finance. That definitely makes evident a complexity of the topic. And well, from speaking on challenges and opportunities, we are now going to move to know some initiatives that were created to contribute to overcoming those barriers. So our next speaker is Brian Parham. He is a fellow and ASAP program manager for the Lightsmith group. Previously, Mr. Parham was the chief of staff at the ICCF group, where he managed global operations and oversaw multiple global environment facility grants with programs in Africa and Latin America. Mr. Parham holds an MBA from the University of Cambridge Business School and was a Parker Scholar at North Carolina State University, where he earned a BS in Biological Science and a BS in International Studies. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Angela. I will try to share there's Mike. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today to speak. Like they said, my name is Brian Parham, and I am the program manager for the ASAP project at the Lightsmith Group. A quick background on the Lightsmith Group. We're a global private equity firm, which runs the first private growth equity fund focused specifically on climate resilience and adaptation. You may have heard us in the news recently. In January, we announced the close of our climate resilience fund with $186 million in commitments to be invested in climate resilience companies. The Adaptation SME Accelerator Program, or as we call ASAP for short, is part of our work to engage with companies at an earlier stage than we usually work with in our fund, to help grow the investment ecosystem, help these smaller companies to scale, and encourage private sector investors to come into the space to engage with these companies. Specifically, the ASAP program is meant to identify, integrate, and accelerate climate resilience and adaptation solutions in areas where these solutions are most needed, which is often developing countries. ASAP focuses on small and medium enterprises, offering solutions throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America as our three geographic areas of scope. The program is led by the Lightsmith Group, but it's made possible by funding from the Global Environment Facility, with Conservation International support as the implementing agency, and the Inter-American Development Bank. More information can be found at our website, which is, it's not there, which is climateasap.org. So the ASAP project aims to target, these are some of the key barriers that we see to the supply and uptake of climate adaptation solutions. We don't aim to address the institutional regulatory side, we're aiming to address the private sector side. So that includes the knowledge and technical capacity barriers, including inadequate awareness and understanding of the climate risks and opportunities, inadequate availability of decision useful information for end users, and inadequate capacity to use those technical solutions. There are also the market failures, which we're previously discussed, including unknown payback and benefits, inadequate access to finance, and risk aversion to these investments. The third area that we address is the technology barriers and challenges, including inadequate track records for these innovations, the mismatch between availability of climate solutions and the user's needs, gaps in technology maturity, and the inadequate access for data. So this project, in the summer of 2020, we published a peer-reviewed taxonomy which built upon and harmonized existing definitions, taxonomies, and approaches, including the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Activities, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the UNEP Ipcc Climate Technology Center and Network Taxonomy, among others, to come with a harmonized definition around what climate adaptation solutions can be. The taxonomy was designed to be dynamic and inclusive and to be used by a broad range of stakeholders, including entrepreneurs and market participants, including investors, lenders, incubators, accelerators, end user customers, and then governments and other public good oriented organizations who are providing financing. It was meant to be able to be applied in any sector, company size, or geography so that it could adapt to the local context of climate-related challenges. And really the core idea behind it, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail, but the core idea is that climate adaptation solutions are highly dependent on the local context of the impacts that are being felt, and then the solutions that are developed must be responding to those impacts contextually. And we think that there's a big opportunity for those solutions that are already developed to scale and be applied in other regions. After we developed the taxonomy, we applied it to map out companies across our 3 geographic focuses, and we found over 400 companies, and that's a growing list, and 150 plus were found in Latin America alone. This included companies in a wide range of sectors, and this is not an exclusive list, but it includes agriculture, water, finance, supply chain management, climate intelligence, healthcare, and energy. And that database is publicly available through the website, climateasap.org. So the taxonomy defines an adaptation SME as a company which provides technologies, products, and/or services for users to either address systemic barriers by adaptation by strengthening the end user's ability to understand and respond to climate risk, and oftentimes it's or contribute to preventing or reducing material physical climate risk and the adverse associated impacts on assets, economic activities, people, and or nature. The end users for this, and you can see some examples that I've listed here, but the end users can be anyone from single-use customers to other businesses to governments using the solutions that these companies are providing. So in addition to those 2 criteria within the taxonomy, to be included in both the ASAP database and then the Accelerator program that I'm going to speak to you about in a few minutes, the companies must also be based in and or offer significantly their products or services in developing countries, and then also have the ability to define, measure, and monitor their adaptation-related outcomes. So this is a quick overview of how we classify the different adaptation solutions. We look at the types of adaptation solutions provided, the industry and sectors which those solutions are currently being applied to and can be applied to, the types of physical climate risks and hazards that are being addressed, and then the geographical context that it is currently being used. I'd like to focus a little bit on the targeted climate hazard and related risks. So this can give you an idea of some of the challenges that companies can address. So we classify them in 3 big buckets. One is the key climate-related hazards. These are the classic temperature variability, changing precipitation, and inclement weather. Then you have key risks on physical and biological systems. This includes heat stress and heat waves, cold waves, wildfires, drought, water stress, and you can see the rest of the list here. And then the third bucket is the key risks on humans and managed systems. So one area that is kind of big in the companies that we've found is addressing reduced agriculture productivity and food security, damages to physical infrastructure, reduction in water availability and quality, and then the spread of pests and disease and broader impacts to human health and livelihood. So I wanted to include a little bit of the regional reference, and this is an infographic from the Ipcc 6th Assessment Report Working Group 2 that came out in February on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerabilities to Latin America. This goes through listing the ongoing and forecasted impacts in a variety of sectors. Those sectors include water, food and fiber and ecosystem products, cities and infrastructure, health and livelihoods. I really see a lot of overlapping sectors between the taxonomy and the companies that are addressing these solutions and these challenges that have been identified in the recent report. So I wanted to talk briefly about metrics because that's an important part of our taxonomy and the ASAP programs. And here are some examples of how climate adaptation impacts can be measured. And the important thing to know is it's not a one-size-fits-all metric. Now, I do want to, we feel that measuring impact is important as a company baseline because investors will want to be able to measure and monitor the impacts that their investments are having. And so as a part of your climate adaptation narrative, being able to succinctly link the climate adaptation metrics with your business is going to be an important part of attracting private sector investments into your company. We don't think that this has to be complex and it can be aligned with the key business outcomes, but it is important to be able to link that directly to addressing climate-related impacts. So with that understanding of the broader ASAP taxonomy, we are moving forward to engage with climate solutions companies through our Accelerator Initiative, which is really the third stage of the ASAP program. And this program is being run in partnership with Village Capital. And it's a one-week intensive program that will link companies to work with one-on-one with industry experts, investors, and other ecosystem partners to further develop the networks and tools to describe their climate adaptation impact and story, but then also to scale that impact. So this cohort is specifically targeted for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we will select 8 companies to participate in this year's cohort to join 8 other companies that have been selected from Asia and 8 companies that have been selected for the Africa region. So they'll be able to connect and learn from those companies as well on how to apply their solutions and make connections within that network. So I can advise as far as companies who are looking to apply to the program, the link is here, but really try to use the taxonomy and help us understand the context of your company's solution and how it's being used to adapt to impacts of climate change where you are currently. So those applications are open until April 8th, and the program will take place in mid-June. And with that, I'm done with my remarks. Look forward to some questions.
Thanks, Brian, for sharing this information about the ASAP project. We also believe that there are many small and medium-sized enterprises in the Latin American and the Caribbean region that have products, technologies, and solutions that can support climate change adaptation and resilience. and definitely identifying, integrating, and incubating them will contribute to scaling climate change adaptation solutions in the places where they are needed the most. So thank you very much. Okay, now we are going to hear from our last speaker about another crucial kind of support for SMEs. So Nora Najeni works with the United Nations Environment Program, managing the Global Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Fund. The project is co-implemented with the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Nora has worked over the past 7 years in the field of ecosystem-based adaptation, dryland management, and climate change resilience in Africa and Southeast Asia. She holds a master's degree in environmental management and development from the Australian National University. Having grown up in rural Kenya, she is passionate about supporting local and rural communities, particularly women and youth. Nora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's webinar. So let me start first by sharing my screen. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Angela. So as Angela has introduced me, my name is Nora Ngeny. I work with the Global EBA Fund on the Global EBA Fund project under the UNEP partner. Our second partner is IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, who actually manage the fund and the grantees process. So it's my pleasure to be with you today to talk about this fund. So next slide, please. Okay, so what is the Global EBA Fund? I think it's important to start there. So the Global EBA Fund is a quickly deployable mechanism that we use to support innovative and catalytic approaches to ecosystem-based adaptation. This fund was created with the aim of helping people to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. So Ipcc, which is under the federal government of Germany, its International Climate Initiative, committed 30 million euros towards this fund. It started officially last year, and in March, the first call for proposals was announced on the 27th of March of 2021. So as mentioned earlier, this project is implemented jointly by IUCN and UNEP, with the aim of reaching or supporting projects that actually are innovative and can help to catalyze change, which help to overcome different barriers to EBA. So a number of these barriers have actually been mentioned by my co-panelists today, and three of the main ones I think identified by the Global Commission on Adaptation are awareness, governance and institutions, as well as planning and finances, are the three key barriers. And that is why through the EBA fund, these three are our objectives: to try and scale up EBA action or ecosystem-based adaptation action in order to build awareness and understanding, to address issues related to planning as well as other governance gaps, and to seek solutions to the finance gaps. And we talk about EBA, but I think sometimes it's important for us to actually define it so people understand what we're talking about as ecosystem-based adaptation. So the Global EBA Fund uses the Convention on Biodiversity's definition of EBA. So what do we say ecosystem-based adaptation is? This is, and I will read verbatim, this is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of the overall adaptation strategy to help people to adapt to adverse effects of climate change. Why is this important? I think it's important because we have to use nature that is locally available to us, what is surrounding us, to be able to adapt to challenges that are facing us related to climate change. And overall, utilizing locally appropriate actions and nature that's available locally in order to address this climate change and climate risks that we're facing. I think furthermore, despite its high cost effectiveness, EBA is generally overlooked as an adaptation option, and that's why we need to scale this up. EBA has been known to give returns of 1:4, a ratio of 1:4, and therefore I think it's important for us to focus on this as an effective measure for resilience to climate, and as well as building in building our resilience to the climate change. So what do we fund? What does a global EBA fund? One, we support projects that contribute to the implementation of EBA, as I have just defined, that result in catalytic impact, which means impact beyond even just the place where the project is being implemented. And this could be either having it replicated in other areas, taking a project that's been done elsewhere and replicating in the local area, and just creating catalytic impact around you, as well as being able to either add value or upscale an existing piece of work. So we do prioritize applicants who have, one, been able to implement this type of projects before and are well grounded in the area of work that they are proposing. And these applicants also need to have experience in the type of projects that they're applying for and in the size of projects that they're applying for. And we're really encouraging applicants to have inclusive, or to be inclusive in terms of local communities, utilizing indigenous knowledge, being gender responsive and gender inclusive in the actions in order to apply to the fund. So what do we give in terms of the fund? This is a small grants type of fund where we give between $50,000 to $250,000 in funding. Sometimes we can give above that, but that would have to be given in exceptional circumstances and with strong justification. The projects in general run from about, currently we've been receiving applications for projects that run about 24 months, but with the duration can go up to 36 months and higher in exceptional circumstances as well. Who can apply, or what countries are eligible to apply? One, these are either single or multiple countries that are eligible for official development assistance, ODA. This list is available on our page. I'm going to drop all of the links after my presentation, just so that you can have a reference point of who can apply to the fund and what countries these. So you can be from a different country, say from the OECD countries, and be implementing a project, say in Guatemala or Honduras or in any country really around the world, as long as they're in the OECD list of official development assistance. So examples of recipients to these funds, these range from local NGOs and international organizations, community-based organizations, organizations that deal specifically with vulnerable communities, indigenous peoples organizations, think tanks and research institutions. We've also tried to encourage applications from universities towards the fund. And a major one, and what's under discussion today, is private sector, and I'll talk about it a little more in a further slide. But in this, we also have people who are exempt, or organizations that are exempt from applying to the fund. And this include UNEP and IUCN offices, as well as government partners. So through the regulation of our donor, Ipcc, we're not able to give financing to governments. However, partners and organizations that work with different government agencies are eligible to apply to the fund. So a little bit about how to apply. So far, from March of 2021 till the 28th of February this year, we've received over 1,200 applications to the fund. This has been a varied range of applications, varied range of projects targeting different types of ecosystems. And it's been really exciting to see the innovations that people have out there. So we have only been able to give grants to the first 8 from the first cohort. The first cohort, I think we received about approximately 270 applications. And from that first cohort, me having met all the criteria, we had funded 8 projects, a number of which are actually from the Latin America region. I will also drop a link here for you to see who the grantees are so far. Interestingly, 2 of those grantees are actually private sector organizations. And hence, I think we need to just encourage more and show that it is possible to access this fund as private sector and small scale enterprises, small and medium enterprises. So we receive applications through the year, but we have 2 cutoff dates per year when the projects are considered. The next cutoff date is coming up. It's going to be on the 15th of July of this year. And as I mentioned, these are received on a rolling basis. So anytime the applications are received, they will be considered as of the next cutoff. And I think we're now strongly trying to encourage people to collaborate and put in joint applications in terms of collaborating and partnering with local communities, with SMEs, just being more diverse in who they reach out to and who they partner with, particularly recipients in the countries and the regions or the localities where this project is targeted. So a little bit on the private sector engagement. So this project is not designed specifically for private sector, but it does include private sector as a key stakeholder who can and should access the fund. So small and medium scale enterprises have very high potential to create a catalytic impact on the ground, because they are the heart and the soul of our value chains. From agriculture to forestry and very many different sectors, SMEs play a role, and therefore they have the potential to be able to scale up ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, and therefore are actually eligible to the fund. So we like to encourage private sector either to apply on their own or to partner with NGOs, with CBOs, non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, as well as even international organizations to apply to the fund. And I think key to mention is that when private sector organizations apply to the fund, it is not for-profit purposes. You have to show or demonstrate that these the actions that and interventions that you would like to implement are not for profit. Something else that needs to be submitted as part of the eligibility requirement are at least 2 years of audited accounts. I think we're in discussion to have that at 1 year, but it's currently 2 years of audited accounts. Demonstrate experience with the type of project or the type of intervention that is being proposed to the fund, and have legal registration. So the applicant organization must have some legal registration which can be demonstrated and would have to be submitted to the fund. So are there avenues, I think, for small scale access to small scale financing, such as a Global EBA fund? Yes, there are. And we'd like to encourage you to either apply, share with your partners who can apply to the fund. If you would like sessions for us to be able to give more detailed sessions on how to apply to the fund, I think that's something that we'd organize. And on the next slide is just a contact page for you to be able to, 1, get more information through the website, and 2, to be able to contact us directly for additional information. So I'm happy to respond to any questions that you have, and we look forward to seeing an increase in the number of applications from this region, particularly related to the small and medium scale enterprises. I think I will hand back now to the moderator, back to Angela. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Nora. It's very valuable that the Global EBA Fund is working on promoting the participation of non-traditional actors. And it is great that we can share this kind of opportunities with the SMEs, who are one of the priority non-traditional actors for the Latin American and the Caribbean region that we would like to engage in adaptation process. So thanks again. Okay, we are on time and we have some minutes for questions and answers. So please leave your questions on the chat box on YouTube, please. We already received a couple of them. So the first one would be for Sumali, if you are there.
Yes, hi.
Yeah. So the first question is, which examples of adapted infrastructure do you have in mind?
Let's see. So examples of adapted infrastructure, perhaps I'll take the example of infrastructure that can be used to reduce flood risks in cities. So very often hydrodynamic modeling is used to assess very high flood risk areas in cities. And according to the results of those studies, resilient road and rail infrastructure, which can also just simply include different types of spatial planning, are implemented. Other examples, for example, materials that are resilient to flood water are used in piping systems. Another type of adapted infrastructure is semi-permeable pavements. And also to mention that nature-based solutions such as planting of trees and having green zones in cities is becoming more and more of an important factor in city planning. What I think I just want to quickly note is that all these resilient infrastructure solutions have to be locally adapted. So it needs a multi-stakeholder consultation approach across municipalities, water utilities, communities, project developers, etc., to assess which is the right solution for which part of the country, the region, the city, etc.
Thanks, Somali. Perhaps you can also address the second question and give some examples of economic incentives set up for governments and small and medium-sized enterprises to invest in adaptation.
Sure. Maybe what I should mention first is that in creating economic incentives, it's really important to align public finance with the Climate Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals. And these incentives could include, for example, to create new financial instruments such as insurance products that protect agriculture-based SMEs from climate-related disasters such as extreme drought and flood events. The government could also create incentives for both domestic and international investments towards deforestation-free supply chains, and that's really relevant for the LAC region, given the forested area that it has. Governments could also redirect subsidies towards greener solutions. For example, providing subsidies for climate smart technologies that SMEs can then adapt within their supply chains and businesses. Taxes can also be used as an economic instrument to basically redirect investments in those areas that are greener, cleaner, and benefit communities as a whole.
Thank you very much, Somali. Okay, we have a third question for Brian and Nora as well. And I think they have already shared on the chat box all the links related to applications. But please, if the attendees see that there is something missing, that some information you would like to know, please let us know. And perhaps Brian and Nora can give us more information about the language requirements for the applications or other kind of details. Thank you.
Sure. So the application should only take about an hour on the link for the Accelerator program. We do have the ability to receive applications in Spanish, but I think the preferred language is in English for this program. And yeah, it's a fairly straightforward form to walk through on the link that I provided to apply. Like I said, I just wanted to reemphasize the key to a successful application is being able to apply your climate adaptation rationale behind the solution that your company is providing. So being able to clearly describe that is going to be an important part of a successful application.
I think to add on to that with regards to the Global EBA Fund, we also receive applications currently only in English. We're looking into other languages, but for now, I think the only ones we receive are in English. We're trying to produce products right now, knowledge products, in the multiple languages. At least the summaries will be released in multiple languages, but for now, in terms of applications, these are only in English. And I think to just similar to what Brian just said, in terms of being keen on certain things in order to be able to make it through the initial screening stages and for consideration. And for the Global EBA Fund is demonstrating what actual climate change adaptation or ecosystem-based adaptation actions are being undertaken for this project. So for example, we've received very many applications on things like clean stoves, which is a lot more related to mitigation than it is to adaptation. So in order for you to be effective and not feel like you've applied to the fund and it's not really come out successfully, you need to actually look at the criteria really carefully so that you can understand, do you meet each of these requirements that are indicated in our case. These are all detailed in the Global EBA Fund Grant Manual. I think I'll also put it on the link, a link to that manual. So yes, please ensure in all of the, especially for the private sector, showing how this actually contributes to restoration or various adaptation actions, regardless of what ecosystem you're working in, whether it's in the marine, the grasslands and the rangelands, forest ecosystems, or even agriculture. These are different key areas and key ecosystems that are being targeted, only that it requires demonstration of what adaptation action and climate resilience this project or intervention you're proposing would lead to. So in terms of applications, we have two stages. The first stage is a concept note stage, which is quite straightforward. It's just a table that is filled in. And thereafter, once your project is identified as one of the successful ones, you'll be invited to submit a full proposal. So a full proposal only comes at a second stage. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nora. We have a question for you again. I think you have already touched this, but if you can clarify again. And the question is, are local governments eligible for such finance with the GBAF?
Okay. Thanks for the question. So no, local governments are not considered for the funds. The national government, provincial, local governments, as long as they are governments, they are not eligible to apply. However, I should reiterate that organizations, partners who work with these local governments or the national government level can apply, and this can include actions that you're actually working with the local government on. It could be, for example, you're doing a restoration, some restoration action or something to do with forest restoration, and you're working or at least contributing to some of the aims and the policies or targets for the local government, then the partners, yes, most definitely can apply, but not the government specifically on the application as one of the applicant organizations. I hope that clarifies to you.
Thanks, Nora. And Brian, some of the attendees are asking about an email where they could contact the ASAP initiative directly.
I'm trying to remember the direct email. There's a contact link on climateasap.org, which is the website that has all of our resources. And so the best way to contact us through the email there.
Okay, great. We are going to share that on the chat box. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, so I think we can go for our last question on Mentimeter. So you can use the same link you used at the beginning, but we are going to share again the link on the chat box. So please go back to that link. So here we have our last question for our audience today. And this is, would you be interested in applying to any of the initiatives? We have 4 options, yes. Second option, no, but I know someone who would. Third option, maybe in the future. Or fourth option, I would like to know more before I decide. So please go to the link, the same link we shared with you at the beginning of the session, and answer this question, please. I cannot see any answers coming. Can we share the link again on the chat box, please? Okay, we are going to give 3 more seconds. And otherwise, we are going to give the final takeaways and finish the session. Okay. So thanks, everybody. Just to deliver some key messages from the session today. From Gustavo's presentation, the financial resources available for adaptation to climate change have increased in recent years. However, the adaptation finance gap is not narrowing. Adaptation currently accounts for less than 25% of global climate finance. And yet, according to Sumali's presentation, in the LAC region, SMEs are a primary source of employment and key supplier of goods and services to a large share of population. So this sector comprises as much as 99% of all businesses in the region and 60% of the employed population and 25% of the GDP. So the financing gap for SMEs in developing countries is 5.2 trillion per year, and in the LAC region accounts for the second largest share with 23% of the total global finance gap. About Brian's presentation, the ASAP initiative developed a taxonomy for SMEs to support businesses in adapting to climate change. Even if current audience cannot apply to the current accelerator, reviewing the taxonomy and opening the dialogue with the Lightsmith group would be very interesting. The applications are open until April 8th to participate in the one-week intensive program assessing the adaptation needs, benefits, and exchange with a wide variety of experts. And from Nora's presentation, I highlight that the global EBA focuses on the role of EBA as a catalytic measure for adaptation to climate change. GBAF looks to adding value and upscaling measures that are looking for applicants with experience in implementing EBA interventions, and 50,000 to 250,000 funded with official development aid recipient countries. So I think that would be all for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining the session, and have a great day.